I am so excited to see all of your faces from all these places across the US. When Robbie kind of first floated the idea of doing a couple lectures about tapestry, one of the things she said was, I just know that this talk about Helena will draw people from all over the country. And she's like, and Bay is so smart, it's going to be so great. So I think that's always good energy to bring into any talk. So welcome to this deep dive into the planning and recording behind the work of tapestry. You know, I was first introduced to Helena Hernmarck's work at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where there are these two enormous pieces hanging in the fountain court on the second floor. And I worked there, and I would go up to the second floor on my breaks and walk around the tapestries and just kind of have these moments of reflection that were really important in my daily work there. And seeing those pieces in person, you know, just made me appreciate what a massive undertaking it must be to create a tapestry of that size and complexity. Leading us tonight in this discussion will be May Colburn, Hernmarck's studio assistant and archivist, and we are so thrilled to go behind the scenes with May tonight. So welcome.
Okay, I will take the stage and I will share my screen shortly. First, my visual description, because I think you'll see a small image of me in the corner. I'm a white woman in my early 30s with shoulder-length blonde hair against a white background. So let's get started. Okay, I'm assuming everybody can see this, and if not, I'll look for a reaction indicating otherwise. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Weavers Guild of Minnesota, and thank you to Robbie for inviting me, and to Betsy and Karin for organizing this. And as I believe Karin said earlier, my folks are tuning in from Duluth, and I miss them, and I miss Minnesota at this point. It's been quite a while since I've been able to visit. I'm speaking to you from Newburgh, New York, which is about an hour and a half north of New York City along the Hudson. So a bit of background. I met Helena in 2015 as I was finishing my MA in the History of Design and Curatorial Studies in a program that's hosted jointly by Parsons, the New School for Design, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. And my research focused on contemporary tapestry workshops with a special interest in the relationships between artists and weavers and patrons or clients. So it was through that research that I learned about Helena's work and found out that her studio was just about an hour and 15 minutes north of New York City in Ridgefield, Connecticut. So the story goes that I emailed Helena and she invited me for a visit. And I have been working for her since, first as a weaving apprentice and now in this kind of fluid role between studio manager and fabricator and archivist. So this image that I'm introducing our work with shows Helena at her 8-foot loom, and I'm helping her at the wool table, and in the background is a 14 by 30-foot wall of wool that is the centerpiece of Helena's studio, and this is wool that's organized according to the colors of the rainbow. So there is a great deal that's happened since 2015. And in this presentation, I want to give you a glimpse into the major project, the major commission that we recently completed in September of 2020. And then in the second half of this presentation, I'd like to turn to Helena's archive, which is a focus for me and I think sheds a lot of light on both her design process and Helena's weaving technique, which I believe will be very interesting for all of you. So I will begin with this major commission. This commission was unique in that it involved the completion of 2 sets of tapestries that would be rotated every 6 months. In other words, they'd be exchanged every 6 months, that is in the spring and the fall. And this commission was for a residential elevator lobby of 35 Hudson Yards, which is one building in one of Manhattan's newest and largest and perhaps most outrageous real estate developments. So this commission began in 2016, and as I said, concluded in September of this past year. What I'm showing you here is the design for the first set of tapestries called Flowers. And there are very large purple flowers in the foreground, and then the design features kind of green leaves in the background, and then a great deal of blue sky up above. And looking at this, you might notice that the vantage point looks somewhat unusual. This is because this set of tapestries was designed to stretch from the floor to the ceiling and then across the ceiling, that is flat across the ceiling, here seen in the direction, from the direction of the viewer. So you can imagine the ceiling tapestry posed a tremendous design challenge. 1, how do you design for such a tight space? 2, how do you design for such a close viewing distance? And 3, how do you even begin to engineer a tapestry for the ceiling? So, fortunately, Helena has some 60 years of experience designing tapestries, and she also does meditation as part of her weekly Tai Chi. And it was in meditation that this idea occurred to her. So this slide illustrates the approach that she took to the design process. On the left is a cardboard box with a strip cut out of it that goes from the bottom to the top and then across the top. And on the right is a photograph taken through this cardboard box. So this strip more or less approximates the space that the tapestry would occupy in the elevator lobby. And you can imagine that depending on where you take this, you can end up with a whole range of wonderfully dramatic enlarged imagery. So we took truly hundreds of photos through this box, poking our iPhones up through the hole in the bottom. And in the end, we didn't have to go very far. This photo on the right was taken in Helena's neighbor's backyard. Okay, so we're moving fairly quickly from the design process to the actual tapestries themselves, which of course begin with sheep. And what I'm showing you here is an absolute screen full of beautiful sheep. So Helena's wool wall, again 14 by 30 feet, consists primarily of wool from the Swedish Rhea sheep. And these sheep are known for their long, strong, and most importantly, lustrous wool, which makes them ideal for carpets and especially ideal for tapestries, which really benefit from a luminous fiber. At the same time, the length and strength of these fibers makes them difficult to spin in industrial machines. And as a result, Helena has worked with a specialty spinning and dyeing mill based in Dala-Floda, Sweden, to spin and dye the yarn for each of her major commissions since 1975. So this image shows Helena comparing or matching dye samples of the wool with the design for the flowers tapestry in the background. This next image shows Helena and Sonja Wahlstedt, who used to run Wahlstedt's Textilverkstad, fondling a skein of beautiful, very bright pink wool that was dyed to match the color of sunshine passing through those purple clematis petals. So this exchange with Sweden is important to Helena because it's a way for her to sustain ties to the country where she was born and to support the businesses that inspired her career. So Helena was born in 1941 in Stockholm and attended both Handarbeidsvänner, which is the Swedish handcraft school, in Stockholm, and Konstfack, which is the Royal College of Art and Design, where she graduated in 1963. And as part of this education, she completed an apprenticeship at a weaving firm called Alslund Textilier in Borlänge, Sweden, which was founded in the late 1930s by its namesake, textile designer Alslund. And amazingly, more than 80 years later, this firm still exists. Now helmed by someone who is really around my age, Frida Lindberg, who is 34 years old. And it's this firm that Helena has worked with on many of her major commissions, but I'll emphasize not all of her major commissions since 1975. And this image shows Frida and Helena working together at the loom for the Flowers sample tapestry. This next image shows master weaver Ebba Bergström, who has been at Alslund Textilier off and on since 1984 and is truly a master of Helena's technique, working on the Flowers wall tapestry while it was on the loom. And in front of us is really the full spectrum of colors, blues and greens and turquoise and pinks and purples. To Ebba's left is the actual design, the handheld design that she's using to guide the weaving. And also visible is the beautifully plied green and purple warp yarns. And although it's not visible here, we can imagine the full-sized cartoon suspended underneath the warp, which is more or less a spatial guide for the weavers. So the weaving, the weaving progressed. The weaving of the Flowers tapestries progressed. And this next image shows both Ebba and Tuva, who was her weaving partner. And they worked together on all of these tapestries, taking the Flowers wall tapestry off the loom. And you can imagine the excitement. These two have stood next to each other, in this case, for 9 months. Tuva on the left and Ebba on the right. Just this absolute picture of focus and harmony and balance. And they're finally taking this piece off the loom. So I mentioned that each piece took approximately 9 months to make. And considering there were 2 wall tapestries and 2 ceiling tapestries for each set, so 1 wall and 1 ceiling for each set, this explains the 4-year schedule for this commission. So while this was happening in Sweden, back here in the US, we were very busy trying to figure out a way to install a tapestry in the ceiling. So as you can imagine, this is not the natural configuration for a tapestry, and we, as a result, put a great deal of time and effort and collaboration into figuring out a method to do this. So this slide shows Helena at her loom in Ridgefield, working on an 8x8 foot sample tapestry, woven merely to test various hanging methods for the ceiling tapestry. And to her left is the design for the sample tapestry. There's a flower that's been taken from the actual ceiling tapestry and then placed against this white background with lines radiating outward in 4 directions, drawn in crayon. And so it creates this very nice textured effect. So it was a simplified design, but it was still 8x8 feet. And this job alone took 3 months to weave.
Okay.
Oh, did someone say something? Okay, I'll continue. But this process was crucial because it allowed us to find a backing system that worked. So this photo shows the finished sample tapestry on the right, along with an early idea for a hanging solution. So in front of the sample tapestry is, well, what can I say, quite a scene. Here the idea was to use elk net fencing, which is kind of a grid-like fencing made of plastic, with carbon fiber tubes latticed through it at intervals as a backing for the tapestry so that these carbon fiber tubes, they would stick out about 2 inches on either side and then rest on a narrow ledge that's on the adjacent vertical wall. This was the idea. I'll explain more shortly. So in this photo, Helena is on the left. In the middle is Jim Sorter, who was an industrial engineer and an employee of Helena's late husband, Neil Stiffriant, who was a chair designer. And in front is David Kay, who was one of Helena's assistants in the 70s and spent a week with us during this development phase in 2017. This next slide shows the tapestry suspended across the carbon fiber tubes interlaced into the elk net fencing and suspended on sawhorses. And you can see we are all very curious to see how this works. So Jim is underneath, Jesse Hyatt is next to him, and I'm taking notes. And the questions that we're asking ourselves at this point are, one, is the tapestry bowing? How many carbon fiber tubes are needed? What diameter should the carbon fiber tubes be? Is it even possible to stitch the elk fencing onto the tapestry? So really many fundamental questions to work through at that point. And in the end, we decided not to use the elk net fencing, but instead to use a cloth backing. And this was really much to my relief. It was a great deal of work. We ended up pleating fabric and then machine stitching it into a whole series of very narrow channels at 1-inch intervals that we then hand stitched to the back of the tapestry. So this image shows Jesse Hyatt and Margot Becker stitching the backing onto a sample tapestry. And I'll note here that this was a real chance to bring in a whole bunch of different collaborators. We worked with people who sew garments, we worked with weavers, we worked with conservators, textile conservators, and especially quilters were very helpful because quilters are, of course, accustomed to attaching multiple layers together. This next image is a detail of the stitch. It looks almost like a pine tree. And you can imagine this backing had to be very carefully placed on the back of the tapestry and then basted before it was stitched. And the stitching, the thread actually had to match the color on the face of the tapestry. So we were constantly switching colors as we went along. And we used a linen thread for the stitching because that matches the warp thread. And we actually ended up using a cloth, or a wool fabric for the backing. This image shows a canvas sailcloth. That was an initial idea, but we decided on wool, one, to match the weft fiber, and two, because it's flame resistant. So that turned out to be very important. This next slide shows Jesse and Margot on the floor underneath the tapestry, and they're checking to make sure that their stitches are invisible. So you're really working from one side, but you're stitching on both sides. And so it requires a great deal of finesse and careful finger work to make sure our stitches weren't too big. In the end, we estimated that we had passed the needle through each tapestry some 150,000 times. It took nearly 400 hours for each tapestry, but we did it. And this next image shows, in fact, we're back to the 8x8 foot sample woven in Helena's studio here, and it is successfully suspended across the ceiling in a full-scale mock-up of the elevator lobby that Jim constructed in Helena's studio. So this is the top 8 feet of the elevator lobby, and we use this mock-up to test the hanging solution time and time again with each next step. 1 after it was basted, 2 after it was stitched, and that was for each ceiling tapestry. This next photo is also from the mock-up in Helena's studio. Here we have the actual wall tapestry combined with the actual ceiling tapestry hanging flat across the ceiling. And you may notice that the ceiling tapestry seems to look fairly short. That's because the ceiling portion was actually woven in 2 halves for installation purposes. now we move fairly quickly on to the actual installation at Hudson Yards, and it's truly a scene filled with scaffolding and hard hats and ladders. On the left, the two ceiling halves have been successfully installed, and on the right, those two ceiling halves are being zipped together, and that's an 8-foot 2-inch zipper that we stitched along that edge, and that was a very time-consuming process. This next image shows the actual tapestry installed. So the flowers tapestry successfully installed. And this was in March of 2019. While there was still some construction going on in the building, which meant that it did accumulate some dust, but it has since been professionally cleaned. So that was a great success. And we were very pleased to see this tapestry go up. With flowers being installed, it meant that we got to move on to the next set of tapestries, which I'll show you here. So this is the design for the second set, called Maple Tree. The design includes a large trunk of a tree kind of moving upward and to the left, with this spray of red leaves over top and a bright blue sky overhead. And the ceiling portion of this tapestry was completed first so that we could get to work stitching it back in the US, followed by the wall portion here. And this is on display at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Stockholm, with Tuva, Ebba, and Frida standing in front of it for scale. This event was in August of 2020, right before it was shipped here to the US. And before I show you an installation view, I'll show you a detail of this wall tapestry because it explains, or at least it reveals, a few things about Helena's weaving technique, which I expect some of you might be familiar with. So looking very closely, her technique includes a combination of tabby weave, plain weave, and pattern stitches. So the tabby typically carries the midtones in the image, while the pattern stitches carry the highlights and the lowlights. And it's that combination that creates this very textured effect close up, and from a distance creates this truly dazzling photorealistic effect. So moving outward, we can see the final installation here in the elevator lobby. And this was actually installed during the pandemic in September of this past year, but miraculously, it was neither canceled nor delayed. So we were able to move forward at the scheduled pace. That was a great relief to have this final tapestry installed. And yeah, it marked a transition for us from commission work to focusing more on the archival work that I will present to you now. All right, so at this point in the presentation, I'm going to move away from Hudson Yards and return to Helena's studio. So again, a couple studio shots here. On the left are Helena's looms and her wool ball and a very large studio bathed in sunlight. And on the right are 2 flights of wooden stairs leading upwards. So we're going to imagine that we're heading up the first flight of stairs and entering what is essentially a small office area in Helena's studio. And it's here that Helena keeps the majority of her business archive, which is includes a very important set of documents that she refers to, both as she develops new work and of course, as we present the work to the public. So I'll mention here that this next part of the presentation will focus first on Helena's business archive and then second on her design archive. All right, so starting here, this first element that I'm showing you of Helena's business archive is a tool that I'm sure some of you might be familiar with, namely a recipe book. That is a recipe book for weavers of weaving. And this book includes warp material, weft material, ends per inch, number of ends, plan length, warp weight, whether or not a tapestry has been blocked or not, and the final dimensions. So this particular set of pages includes on the left the Flowers Wall Tapestry, which Helena has marked as number 273, which was begun in January of 2017. And here she's also marked ALT made, which refers to Alles Lund Textilier, who actually wove the tapestry. And on the left is the data for what's described as the ceiling study big. And that's the large 8x8 foot study that I showed you previously that was woven at Helena's studio. And that's marked as 273S, the S referring to study. So you can imagine that this book, and here we're on number 273S, Helena has woven more than 273 tapestries throughout her career. And she has, I think, a total of 4 such recipe books that move chronologically. So she keeps them for a very long time, and she refers back to them often to see how a specific tapestry was made and use those same ideas as she's developing new work. Another essential set of documents in her business archive are her tapestry charts. And this image shows the tapestry chart for the test tapestry woven for Hudson Yards, the 8x8 foot test. And although it's a little bit hard to make out here, I'll describe what we're seeing, what we're looking at. There's an X and a Y axis, and the X axis represents inches, and the Y axis represents time. And then there's a thin meandering line moving from the bottom left to the top right that illustrates the progress of this tapestry as it was being woven on the loom. So Helena has a chart like this for, I think, almost every tapestry that she's ever woven, especially the major work. And often she'll create the chart and then create the projected schedule, the projected line, and then of course trace the actual line near it as she weaves. So especially interesting about these charts is that not only is it, a kind of a graphic rendition of the weaving of the tapestry, she also indicates various other things that happen in her life as she weaves. So on the left in this close-up, she's written struggling with little leaves. And on the right, she's written Christmas party, and above that, Tai Chi. Above that, even alone all day, did 3 rows. So it's filled with information. And on the far left, she includes her own column and also a column for all of her assistants. So MC, I have a column because I was helping during this tapestry. And then HH is, of course, her own column, and then December, November, and then the dates. So these are very rich and I think very special illustrations of Helena's thinking. Okay, so this was, of course, the moment that we were working towards weaving that sample tapestry. And this was in January of 2018, when the client came to Helena's studio to see the sample tapestry hanging in the ceiling of the mock-up. And in this photo, there are actually several people who were laying on the floor, and that's because, of course, the floor represents eye level in the actual lobby. And this is just the top 8 feet. So this particular moment is also marked on yet another set of documentation in Helena's archive, which is this familiar looking graph paper, but reconfigured somewhat. This is a narrow timeline. So this is a pieces of graph paper that have been cut into 2-inch strips and then taped together. And this particular portion of the timeline illustrates, let's see, November and December 2017 and 2018, and that's when we were weaving the test tapestry. And then further on, it's a bit hard to make out, but under April and May of 2018, Helena has marked O watermark S, which is the sample for a tapestry she wove while in residence at the Aldrich Museum in 2018 and 19. And I'll discuss that more later in this presentation. So as I said, this is a timeline. where Helena translates 1 inch to 1 month, and therefore 1 foot to 1 year. And she began this timeline in 1976. So as I'll illustrate in these next 2 slides, it's really become quite long. Here is Helena unfolding it along the wool wall in her studio. And in fact, it turned out to be so long that she had to curve it around the corner. So that is a total of, at this point, 44 going on 45 feet as we enter 2021. So this portion of Helena's archive also includes other types of charts, and I'll introduce them briefly here. This is an early chart documenting feet woven per year from 1976 to 1982. She's keeping track. This is an early financial chart detailing pay per square foot, total time, amount woven per week, the cost of helpers, and profit. So this is really where she's organizing her business, of course, focused around her weaving. And Helena tells a story about how when she was just starting out and developing her technique, she calculated that she could weave approximately 3 square meters per week. And that is compared to what she thought could be woven in the Gobelin technique in the same period of time. Namely, she figured that would be about 1 square meter in a week. So, in other words, her technique is somewhat coarser. However, that it's that coarseness that makes it perhaps so much more appropriate for large spaces, large modern interiors, and viewing the tapestries from a great distance. So at that point, she was really just trying to figure out how much money she would need per week, and then of course how much she needed to charge to make a go of it. And she often figured out what she needed per week and then doubled that to take account for the weeks when she did not have work. Okay, the final element of Helena's business archive are her tapestry folders, and these include correspondence with clients, with architects, with designers, with developers, contracts and financial information, installation specifications, lighting discussions, all the primary documents relating to each tapestry, more or less the project files for each tapestry. And these are just so helpful and so important as tapestries enter museum collections or are included or in an exhibition or written about in an article or book. And I found myself referring to them often in these past months because when the lockdown began here back in March, we embarked on a major oral history project where I called Helena at 3 p.m. 3 days a week and recorded a roughly hour-long interview and then transcribed that interview and created indexes and so on and so forth, so that we have now an oral history on each of her more than 270 tapestries. And these, I believe, are a real pleasure, a real treasure. So before I move on and present some aspects of Helena's design archive, I will just take a brief break to mention that although the majority of Helena's archive is still in her studio in Ridgefield, Connecticut, the first 3 decades of her both business and design archives went to the University of Minnesota's Northwest Architectural Archives in 2008. And of course, Helena plans to give the remainder of the archive at some point in the future. So this is an incredibly rich trove of material right in Minnesota, and includes many of the charts and tapestry folders and even original designs that I'm showing you here, all of which have been cataloged and which are accessible to the public, can be visited by appointment when, of course, it's safe to do so. So if any of you do end up visiting, I would love to hear about it and hear what you learn. So I've chosen to show you one piece of this really vast trove of material here, and that's the original design for Helena's 1970 tapestry called Bay Street in Toronto. And this is really, it's a photograph, it's a street scene, And there are buildings and cars. There's an orange bus in the background and people walking down the sidewalk. And this next slide shows the actual tapestry on the right, along with what was actually a poster, a detail of this tapestry showing the car and the bus close up. That was used to advertise Helena's 1970, I believe, 3 show at the Museum of Modern Art. And I've actually chosen to show you these because this tapestry is currently featured in an exhibition that's organized by the LA County Museum of Art along with the Milwaukee Art Museum, called Scandinavian Design in the United States, 1890 to 1980. And this show considers the long arc of exchanges between these two regions. And so it's very appropriate, I think, that Helena has a piece in the show. So again, that's called Scandinavian Design in the United States, 1890 to 1980. And I believe it will be in Milwaukee sometime in 2022. And I can certainly send more information about that if you're curious. So now I'm returning back to Helena's design archive. And this next slide shows us, again, one more floor up in Helena's studio. Here we're on the 3rd floor, the very top, kind of perched up here. And this is an area that Helena calls her archive of ideas, namely her design archive. And here you'll find magazines, newspaper articles, exhibition catalogs, where her work has been published, a whole number of useful information alongside troves of design material, most of which has found its way into tapestries and some of which is still waiting to be woven. So in this area, you'll find, among other things, an entire drawer full of envelopes with stamps and postmarks and handwriting from all over the world, different places and different generations, which unto themselves, it turns out, can create very evocative tapestry designs. This next slide illustrates that with an example. On the left is the actual envelope that inspired the tapestry envelope from Sweden, which was made in 1992. And on the right is the tapestry on the loom in Helena's studio, woven at a scale of 5 feet by 5 foot 6 inches. So here it looks like the loom is eating the tapestry. In fact, it's just being woven. This next slide shows the finished tapestry envelope from Sweden. And here, looking closely, we'll notice that Helena has interpreted some of the wear and tear, the shadows on the envelope, with a very faint rose path technique, while also carefully weaving the images of the stamps and, of course, the typewritten letters, making out Helena's address in Ridgefield. So in our oral histories, Helena noted that this particular envelope came from her aunt, and that her aunt had a typewriter with a slightly damaged letter H. And so looking at the H in Helena, we can see that the upper bar is just slightly truncated. This tapestry now actually belongs to the Minneapolis Institute of Art, which has a large and growing collection of Helena's work, and is currently featured in an exhibition titled Cloth, Paper, Scissors, Helena Weaves the Everyday, and that is still on through February 7th of 2021. So around the same time, in the early 90s, Helena also created a series of 5 tapestries using envelopes at play with light and shadow. And this began by chance. She tells a story about how she and her husband Niels were looking for a new office manager. They both had their businesses. And so they placed an ad in the paper and they received exactly 100 letters in response. And of course, you open all the letters. And while Helena was doing this, she noticed how the glue was different on every envelope, depending on the manufacturer. And this then led her to string some of the envelopes together and hold them up against the light and see how light and shadow reflected on the envelope. So that's what you see in these seemingly very abstract designs right here. That's in contrast to envelope from Sweden. These really emphasize the lines and the shapes and almost the skeleton of the paper, of the envelopes. So on the left in this slide is the design used to weave a piece titled Envelopes 2 with measurements marked up the side. And this is the case with all of the designs that I'll show you that were used for weaving, as they have either inches or centimeters marked up the side. And on the right is just a portion of the same design that Helena wove as a sample and called Envelopes 1. This next slide shows both of these tapestries on the right in an exhibition that took place just this past year at the Shelter Island Historical Society in Shelter Island, New York. And this was a beautiful exhibition. I'll show you a number of images, exhibition photos. So next to these two envelopes tapestries, in the middle is a piece called Ruskin Tickets from 1994. And then on the left is a piece titled Framed Shadow from 1985, which is woven in a much finer technique to reflect shadows on curtains that are blowing in the wind. This is another view from this room with a few more tapestries revealed. So on the far left is a piece called Crochet Wave from 2008. And then in the middle is a piece called, which is actually, it's a sample for a much larger piece called Currency, done in 1992. Here, another image from the same room. And so we're looking at Framed Shadow on the left and Ruskin Tickets in the middle, and then an envelope tapestry on the right. And it's actually the piece in the middle that I'm going to turn to next, because this illustrates yet another trove of design material in Helena's archive, namely a very large collection of tickets from movies, from plays, from the dry cleaners even, that show up in many of Helena's tapestry designs. So here you can see, this is the design for Ruskin Tickets, how Helena first photographed the tickets and then photocopied the tickets in black and white, and then filled them in with color, with crayon, to create these really complex reds and blues. And of course, the more complex the color, the more exciting it is to weave. So these in particular were tickets that Helena saved from a tour of John Ruskin's home in the Lake District in England. This next slide shows many more tickets and ticket ephemera. So on the left, we can see how Helena has photographed and cropped these tickets. On the right, she's combined them with watercolors in many different colors, black watercolor on paper, and then pasted the tickets, and blue and red and turquoise and yellow, a whole combination of kind of ever-shifting interrelated parts and pieces. And if I'm going to emphasize any processes that are very consistent throughout Helena's design process, it would be photography, cropping, Xeroxing, collaging. These are really at work in every design. So many tickets appear in multiple iterations. We see here a torn admission ticket, number 112. And this is actually used here in a invitation that Helena made for a party at her house, I believe in 1993, that she photocopied and sent to every guest. The same ticket, number 112, also shows up in a tapestry called Torn Ticket, also done in 1993. And here, that half of that ticket is used against this yellow and turquoise background, with the ticket creating a shadow underneath, just to give it that sense of physical dimension. And that's another very consistent aspect of Helena's work. This same ticket shows up again here. So the photo on the right is actually an exhibition view from Helena's 1999 retrospective at FIT in New York. And the ticket on the right, or the tapestry on the right in that photo, is called Ticket Dazzler. And it relates to the design material that I've included on the left. This is also from 1993. So here we can see how Helena photographed the tickets. This admission ticket torn in two, and then looks like a ticket for Haddon Hall in the middle. It says adult as in adult. And then next to it is another iteration of this design where she's photocopied this photograph, and then it looks like she's cut it into pieces so that the design becomes slightly dispersed, just to give it that extra dimension and dynamism. So, and then of course woven it in the tapestry that you can see in the image on the right. So if you look very closely at this exhibition view, in the back is a piece that's blue on top and then yellow and red on the bottom, and it's that I'm going to turn to next. So, noting especially that bottom portion with the yellow and red or orange, we'll talk about this one seemingly very simple scrap of paper that appears in the bottom of that tapestry. And so as you can see, this looks as though it might have been something textured that was photocopied. There's just a little bit of kind of black and white residue at the bottom. And there's also some, looks like cursive script. And then Helena has watercolored on top of it, very bold colors, yellow color on the top, and then this orangish red on the bottom. And this handwriting that you see in the middle is what I'll focus on now, because this is the handwriting of a Swedish weaver, another Swedish weaver, this one called Sigrid Wåhlin, whose weaving recipe book Helena purchased from a friend of hers in the mid-90s, and which is now in the UMN section of her archive. So it's in Minneapolis. And I'll show you here the recipe book itself. On the left is the front cover, and on the right is an inside page. And what we know of Sigrid Wåhlin is that she was born in Stockholm in 1900, and then she moved to Jamestown, Virginia, where she made her living as a weaver. So it's a life that parallels Helena somewhat. So many of us would look at this, what we see on the right, namely the page from this recipe book, and really see a trove of information. It looks like there are weave drafts on the top, and there's text beneath, and there are even some woven samples underneath that. But another thing that we can draw our attention to is simply the visual experience of this page from this book. And this seems to be what Helena has been kind of paying attention to in her design process. So it's actually this book that piece of paper comes from, not this page necessarily, but it's the same script, the same handwriting that has been repeated so many times in a whole series of tapestries that Helena has woven. So the same piece of paper with the reddish bottom and the yellowish top has been used in many tapestry designs. And this slide shows in the middle the design for Color Fields 4, which is from 1998, which is the one you saw in the FIT retrospective. And then Color Fields 5 on the right, also from 1998. And so they're used in slightly different configurations, but it's the same piece of paper that appears in both. And here I'm showing you both tapestries side by side. One is larger than the other. And you can really see how, it's these elements combined. So in addition to the pieces of paper, we have the choice of a background color, and then we have the shadow beneath these floating pieces of paper on top. And that turns out to be very important. It's the shadows that turn out to be, in Helena's tapestries, we learn that shadows are very colorful and require a lot of gradual color blending. That is, for someone who's skilled in Helena's techniques, such as Helena herself, very fun to weave. So Helena returned to these same design elements in 2010 when she got a commission for the Purdue University School of Visual and Performing Arts that involved designing, like Hudson Yards, for a very tight space. So in this case, it was a stairwell, which meant that the tapestry would be seen from both below and above. And you can see both the reddish and the yellow piece of paper and the same blue piece of paper, and actually the same turquoise and yellow piece of watercolor paper as the background that we saw in Torn Ticket earlier. So these two images in this next slide actually give you some sense of the design evolution for this tapestry. So on the left is an earlier design, and you can see all the elements included, the background and then the pieces of paper, but they're flat against the background. On the right is the actual design, and in this case, Helena has slanted the pieces of paper in the direction of the viewer, and also added a second layer to the background. And in our oral history, Helena mentioned that this really happened by happenstance. She just happened to print another set of the background, another copy of the background image. But nonetheless, it does create this much more kind of enticing, inviting experience for someone walking up and down those stairs. Here I'm showing you a sequence of material for the sample that Helena wove for this piece. And on the left is the design that she would have with her at the loom, with the inches marked up the sides. And then in the center is a full-scale cartoon that she would have underneath the warp. And on the right is the actual sample. And looking closely, one can see that she actually wove from left to right. And the sampling process is often a way for her to figure out which direction to weave a tapestry. And this is especially important when there's text involved, because that's, of course, a lot of slanted lines that aren't so conducive in the standard warp and weft structure. So it's also makes sense that Helena chose to weave in the sample some of the text so she could figure that out. Okay, Helena has woven 2 additional tapestries in this series. On the left is a piece called Tabula Rasa 2 from 2010, and on the right, Tabula Rasa 3 from 2011. This slide shows the designs for both of them. And this next slide shows both of these tapestries in an exhibition that took place late 2018 into 2019 at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, called Helena Hernmarck Weaving in Progress. I referred to that a little bit earlier in my talk. So here you'll notice that Tabula Rasa 3 is actually shown on a platform on the floor, which may seem like a surprising choice, but again, that's in consideration of the design. Noticing how these pieces of paper seem to float so freely, almost fly above the background. So you may notice that this tapestry looks fairly different from Helena's other tapestries. It's a fairly different texture, and that's actually because it's a very different technique. This is woven in a double weave, so it's 2 layers, and the background layer actually isn't wool at all. It's something called punchinella, which is the residue from sequin making. So it's basically a band of plastic, often shiny plastic, with a bunch of holes punched in it that Helena folds and then inserts into the warp, and then opens up a layer on top of that where she inserts the wool yarn. So it means that the wool itself doesn't have to carry the structure, and she can actually be much more free in her application of the wool and her use of the wool to render the image. So this is a technique that Helena has chosen not to use in her commissioned work, simply because she's unsure how the plastic or how the punchinella will stand up over time. But it's been a source of really constant interest and innovation for her, really beginning in the 60s and through to the present. The tapestry she has on the loom right now includes this punchinella as the back layer. Okay, here we're moving back to Helena's studio, and this is again the design archive. And on this small wall, we've put up a series of very early designs that Helena produced while she was still at art school in the 1960s. And they may look somewhat unfamiliar to you. We often think of Helena's photorealistic tapestries. We seldom, well, I mean, yeah, many people don't know about her more abstract work from her early years, but this was actually where she developed the techniques that led into her photorealistic work that she began producing later. So these designs come from a series that Helena has called the Greek alphabet series. And they're really very faint watercolor washes with these almost glyph-like markings on them, anticipating, it seems, her subsequent and later interest in weaving text, weaving writing. Some of these designs have been woven. This is an image from of Helena's tapestry called Gamma, which was woven in 1964. And to the left is the study for Gamma. These are both pictured in her 1999 exhibition at Waldemarsudde in Stockholm. And this was woven in what Helena calls her free rose path technique. So yeah, it's a more or less an inlay technique that she's applied very freely to give this almost glitch-like effect. And then she's woven these kind of large gestural markings on the top. And this was actually something that she's talked about. Her weaving, or her art teacher at Kunstfach when she was in art school was Edna Martin. And she encouraged her students to, instead of enlarging their designs into cartoons by hand using graph paper, to instead use photo enlargements to really capture that movement in the initial design. So many of these have not been woven, but there are many that are works unto themselves in her design and in her design archive, and really remain these evocative possibilities potentially to weave in the future. Okay, this following image includes a whole series of things. So we'll begin on the right, and this is actually a round rug. So it's a shaped weaving that Helena wove in 1965. It's called Round Rug Study. So it was a study for a rug that she never ended up producing at full scale. But as I said, it's a shaped weaving with these almost glyph-like markings and evidence of the free rose path technique. And then next to that, and this is a photo from the Aldrich exhibition, is the cartoon for a much later work that she did in 1993 that includes a great deal of cursive script. So here we can really see the evolution of these glyph-like markings to handwriting. So this is the design, and next to it is the finished tapestry, Post and Study, which is actually unto itself a study for a much larger tapestry called Tegelanbud, which Helena wove for the Swedish Post Office. So I'm reaching the end of my talk here, and I would like to conclude by exploring a bit further this exhibition at the Aldrich, because it was really quite unique and a very impressive experience for both of us. So, as you can see, this exhibition actually included a loom in the center of the gallery. And this was where Helena wove and I assisted 3 days a week for the duration of the exhibition. And so we got to meet a lot of people and talk about weaving and weave in public for the duration of that exhibition. It also included what you can see on the right is this shelf or case of design material. And that was design material that relates to each tapestry in the exhibition. And that was very exciting to show the evolution of her design ideas and the actual physical making of them alongside the finished work, which is the tapestry. We can imagine the designs as works of art that are intended to be woven. So in this case, and this is on the far end closest to the loom, in this case, we included material relating to the design process for the tapestry, that Helena actually wove in the exhibition, namely folded letter O, is what it was called. And I actually, when I was showing you parts of the business archive, I pointed out folded letter O in one of her charts. So this design was developed from Helena's interest in signal flags as graphic symbols. So in that case, we included a variety of elements to illustrate that. So in the upper left, we see this international code of signals. Beneath that, we see this booklet that Helena made, where she's composed the signal flags to me into different words or different phrases. So on the left, book arts, and on the right, good food. And then on the right in this slide is a series of watercolors and photocopies that Helena made of various signal flags, in this case, spelling Pepsi Cola. And this was a potential idea for a commission for Pepsi Cola World Beverages in Somers, New York in 1990, which didn't actually end up coming to fruition. She wove something else for them. But these watercolor signal flags have remained in her collection as possible designs to weave for quite some time. So this exhibition gave her a chance to do that. This slide shows on the left the design used to weave this tapestry. So it was a photograph of one of these signal flags that had been folded to give it some dimension, and then photographed against a gray background with very subtle shading, and then just some very light photocopying to include the watermark in the center of this watercolor piece. And on the right, Helena is making dolls to weave with, also known as butterflies, and with the sample for this tapestry on her wool table. And here, side by side, is the cartoon for folded letter O beside the finished tapestry. And both of these were exhibited together in the final weeks of this exhibition at the Aldrich in the main lobby of the museum. And it was quite exciting to see them side by side and to have that great feeling of accomplishment of having finished a tapestry while in residence at the museum. And I'll also mention that this particular tapestry is also now on view in that same exhibition in at the Minneapolis Institute of Art called Cloth, Paper, Scissors, Helena Hernmarck Weaves the Everyday. So you can see it in person there if you're interested. So I will conclude by focusing on one more piece that was in this show, and that's a piece called Crumpled Paper. So here again, we're in the museum lobby, and crumpled paper is on the left. And this was actually the first piece that I ever saw of Helena's, and it was in a book that I came across it called Tapestry, a Woven Narrative, which discusses contemporary tapestry in context. So this design is based off of a piece of Chinese joss paper that Helena received from her friend, Jacqueline Larson, who's recently deceased. And she's crumpled it up to look like a flower. So it has this focal point in the center, and then the orange and the gold are set against this very deep blue background behind it. And like all of her designs, it went through several iterations. So different adjustments to the blue background. At one point it was turquoise, and it was kind of at different scales and sizes. And Helena still has this piece of joss paper. And it was included in that show at the Aldrich. And it's actually currently on a table in her design archive as I speak to you. It's been there for a few months. But it's a design idea that has recently been revisited and reconfigured. And so what you're looking at here is actually a early rendering from Hudson Yards. So when Helena first got word about the commission, the Hudson Yards Commission in 2016, she was told that her work would go in 10 Hudson Yards, which is across the plaza from 35 Hudson Yards, where Flowers is now located. And so she actually designed a piece for that site. And it was only after she had designed this that she got word that her tapestries would be in 35 Hudson Yards. So of course, we're grateful because now we have both flowers and maple tree to appreciate, and we had the great challenge of creating tapestries for the ceiling. But this particular design idea is still in the works, and we're currently in discussion about an exhibition in Sweden, potentially in 2022 or 2023. And Helena is considering having Allison Textilier produce this piece on a somewhat smaller scale than you see here at 4 feet by 10 feet, but it would still be a very impressive and beautiful rendition of this of this set of design elements in her archive. So that brings my presentation to a conclusion. I hope it has given you some food for thought as you approach your own archives. I'll also mention that on the topic of Helena's archive, I have an article coming out in Shuttle, Spindle, and Die Pot sometime in the next month or so that describes the archive in some detail. So you can also learn more there. And I have our websites on the screen, hernmarck.com, and then my own website beneath that, where I kind of chronicle my own activities. So I'm happy to open things up for questions.
Great, let's do it. Thank you, May. I have some questions from the chat that came in right away. So first, let's do kind of a time shift and go to the first half of the presentation.
Okay.
Right, so when you're talking specifically about some of the planning, some of the production. So I think it was right around slide 5, we were talking about sheep and kind of a particular lustrous fiber, right? So can you talk a little bit, can you say again the breed of that sheep?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's RYA. And it is, I believe, considered a heritage breed, which is to say that it, it's kind of a specialty breed. And as I mentioned, because the fiber is so long, it's difficult to spin in an industrial machine. So it really does require a specialty process.
Which is how then she hooked up with the special mill in Sweden, right?
Mm-hmm. Wallstedts. That's called WA with an O over it, LSTEDTS, Wallstedts. And they have been around like long before Helena started working. I think she's worked with 8 members of the Wallstedts family. And they were actually responsible for, I think, breeding back this type of sheep and really making this type of fiber available. Their firm is particularly appropriate for artists because they, of course, can produce so many different colors, but producing large amounts of one color is not their specialty. I should also mention that they are currently shifting their operations somewhat. So I can't guarantee that they're necessarily open for business at this point, but they may be again in the future. So,
like everyone else in the world, right? They're figuring it out.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know specifically a little bit, like, are they using acid dyes for the wool?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Like custom blends must be for color, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, I know very little about dyeing. I know Helena has talked about Sibagagi dyes, okay. Which some of you might know more about that. In other words, it's not natural dyeing. It's a whole combination of, colors that are numbered, but then combining these colors to create new colors.
Given the luminosity of the colors, I was kind of assuming that, and I think just because, as weavers, a lot of the participants are really focused on the behind the scenes, how did we get there? Where are we getting our materials? So then we, just kind of thinking about, I think at one point you said that you had, for those bigger commission pieces, 2 weavers working side by side, right? And then was it for 9 months to complete the big piece?
So yes, so you can imagine the wall tapestry took 2 weavers 9 months to complete. The ceiling tapestry took the same amount of time. And there were, of course, there's a wall tapestry and a ceiling tapestry for each set. So 9 months times 4, approximately.
Just as weavers, anytime you're weaving in public, that's the question you get, right? How long did it take you to make this? But this is kind of like a hidden process. These tapestries are so large and there's so many people involved. It's hard to wrap your mind around that. Let's talk about some of those bigger pieces in situ, the ones by the elevator. So in terms of I guess the question that I'm kind of wondering and that came up in the chat was, these look almost as if they're lit from behind. Can you talk about the lighting a little bit and just kind of the treatment in the space?
Yes. So I'm assuming you can all see this image. This was an extremely complicated space to work in. So if you look closely, you can see there are actual, elevator doors on either side. And then there are actually coves that run along the ceiling and the wall, and the lighting, the lights are installed inside those coves. So they are only 11 inches from the tapestry. And they're, vertical lights like this that basically cross in the center to create a fairly even span across the tapestry. So it's both the lighting and then of course just the sheer luminosity of the, the tapestry that creates this effect. But Helena has never lit a tapestry at 11 inches. 7 feet is typically her preferred distance. So this was a lot of back and forth, and fortunately a very brilliant lighting designer named Rob Leiter, who came to Helena's studio at 7 a.m. the morning of the initial visit with the client, and installed the same lighting system into the mock-up at Helena's studio. So we got a strong sense of what it would look like. It may be a little bit more textured and pixelated than Helena would prefer, a slightly different effect than she's used to, but we've come to terms with it, and it creates something special. I'll also note that these coves also made the installation just that much more difficult, because again, you have this gigantic ceiling tapestry, and with the carbon fiber tubes in, and they're basically, you can't take them out. So with them in, you roll up half of the ceiling tapestry, and it's a good 1 foot in diameter, and about 130 pounds each for each half. And so you really need all that scaffolding to get them up there. And they have to be, brought up in one direction and turned in another direction, and then somehow kind of connected on either side and then pulled out almost like a garage door in either direction and then zipped together. So yes, they are tapestries, first and foremost, but they're also these engineering feats that have a lot of, kind of engineering elements on the backside. So.
Yeah, I mean, I've rolled out an 8x10 rug, and my boyfriend and I almost broke up that day.
Oh, no.
So I think, so I can imagine how much more complicated this would be if we're talking on that scale. I think also too, we think about designing a tapestry, and you think about designing it, on the loom, the image, but I myself am not thinking about the wall it will hang on, how much this will weigh, what will need to support it. And did you find that a lot of her archives really helped to kind of go into that detail?
So much, yes. I mean, she's engaged with the architects really from the beginning of every design process. So looking at a space, designing for a space, which involves, considering, well, which direction will people be walking towards the tapestry from? What distance will people be, seeing the tapestry and experiencing the tapestry? What is appropriate for the space? What will warm up the space? Of course, thinking about various themes, but of course the space really determines the design process, and that's unique. And I think that that can be a tricky conversation when it comes to understanding tapestry as an art form, because as I'm sure you've understood, Helena's tapestries take a very long time to make, and it's the labor that is the main cost. And because of that, she has chosen not to make many tapestries on spec, especially not large tapestries. Instead, working on commission is really most appropriate because you get these, payment installments and you can proceed with the work. So that's where the art is in the negotiation with the space and the client, and of course, a whole host of weavers and people who you're working with as well.
Yeah. Especially if you know that 4 pieces are about to, fuel you for 2 years.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I am kind of curious about your work as an archivist.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to me, it would seem that any archival work would be about making decisions. Here's what belongs here. Here's what we can't keep because we don't have space,
Mm-hmm.
or it doesn't fit. In looking through what she had saved, what surprised you because it was in there, and what were you able to fill in, kind of from the interviews?
Well, yeah, so many charts and charts that forms that I could really never have imagined. I mean, I've never thought about a life that way, but a life that really spans tapestries woven. And again, these are, 1, 2, 4-year projects alongside life events. I think there's something really magical about that. So I was very surprised to see that. And I think first and foremost, for me, it was a matter of understanding that Helena is herself a consummate archivist. And she has put a great deal of effort into documenting her career. And we can all, benefit from that. So at this point, I tend not to move anything. I have not discarded anything. It's been more a matter of seeing what's there. And one of our kind of mid to long-term goals is to create a catalog raisonné of Helena's tapestries. So that's a more or less comprehensive overview. That would include kind of a basic set of information. So the oral histories were very helpful in beginning that process. And they give me a direction. I mean, so much of this archive, especially because it's so vast, it really is a matter of kind of finding a way for me personally to move through it in a way that is kind of ordered and logical on my own terms. And it will be many years before I've seen all of it. But I'm, in working with Helena and then in working with the archive, I'm kind of committing to memory many details that, I think I might otherwise overlook or kind of maybe fail to recognize or understand their value. So.
It's like getting a translation of the marks. Right? I see these on the page. Now I know they mean this.
Uh-huh.
And I can take that forward with me. In the process of kind of interviewing Helena about her work, did you get a sense of which tapestries or which work she is most proud of? Or, the piece that she would look at and say, yep, that one's my masterpiece?
Mm-hmm. I certainly did. And maybe that's for, the best of. Maybe that's a presentation Helena can give to the Weavers Guild. It was very interesting to find that there were some tapestries that she was so eager to talk about and really had, very big stories. And there were other tapestries that, well, she would rather not talk about that were, minor in her view, even if they were quite large. And much of that really came down to the level of artistic freedom that she had for a specific commission, and also the point in her career. So I was at the studio today, and the big project today is to try to see if we can take back a set of tapestries that she wove in 1973 for Bethlehem Steel, which has of course been acquired multiple times in the intervening decades. But these are pieces that she's really excited about because they illustrate the it's not the Bessemer method, but it's a similar method in steel making where you have this, very bright light, flames, and it's the reflection of that light that she's just so excited about, the way it appears in her technique. And it was still, the early 70s was when she was just figuring out her photorealistic techniques. So those in particular are pieces that she's very excited to be able to show more as examples of her work.
Can we scroll to like number 24 or so? I think it's in this early set.
Mm-hmm. This is
25. There we go. So this piece has
this one.
Okay. Yep, this one. It has such amazing reflections on the sides, and in all the planning process and all the thought process, could you plan for that, or was this some sort of like amazing accident?
Well, it's nice that you appreciate it. No, this is of course a client who loves high gloss, but we didn't anticipate this, and I don't think Helena loves it. It can create this kind of distorting effect, especially in photos where we're seeing it from a little bit further back. I find it quite exciting, and there is something to it, I think, but no, that was largely unplanned. So certain things are beyond our control, certain things are within our control. This entire commission was such a lengthy and detailed and complex negotiation with the architect and the developer, the designer, a lot of people. And as you can imagine, tapestry is a really foreign medium for everybody. Yeah. So the mere fact that the weaving had to begin 4 years before the actual installation was terribly confusing to people. And I'll also mention that this elevator lobby had to be reconfigured to fit the tapestries and not the opposite way around. So you can't just cut a tapestry, right? I mean, at this point, we went down, I think it was it was probably in January of 2019, and they were still constructing this lobby. And let's see, yeah, they had actually built the ceiling so narrow that the tapestry wouldn't fit. So we had to politely ask them to change that. So it was a lot of, renderings going around, and like it's the soft stuff of tapestry versus the hard stuff of concrete and architecture and steel. And in particular, this Hudson Yards is built over a set of railway yards. And so there are these gigantic steel beams that go, really far down into the earth underneath, below these skyscrapers. So, certain things were kind of set in stone, and we had to work around them. Also, regrettably, and for those of you who, may in the future visit New York or live in New York and care to visit these tapestries, they're not open to the public, but if you say you'd like to see Helena's tapestries, you'll probably be allowed to enter and see them up close. On the right, in this image, you can see the cove, and the cove actually covers, I think, around about a foot of the tapestry, and that was unplanned, and that was fairly disappointing, just because again, it was starting the tapestry back in 2017, and then construction occurring later on, and so a portion of the tapestry is concealed by these coves.
If we were to go to Helena's website, would we happen to find a list of the commissioned works and where they could be found, or if they're available to be seen by the public?
We don't have anything so detailed. There is a list of commissions, and I believe it's selective, so it doesn't include everything. But let's see. We're always very eager for people to see work in person and then report back to us. So if that's a possibility for you, please let us know. There's an email address on Helena's website, and we can tell you where you might find a piece. So thank you.
Point us in one of 200 directions.
Yes. Yes. But of course, there are kind of tapestries that are high on the list as far as you know, exactly where are they, and where were they last seen, and what is their condition. So
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of one more technical question came through in the chat here about the installation work. So as installation goes up, I'm expecting that it's up for a long time because this is pretty, this is a pretty substantial process. Is there kind of an installation team, that says, hey, 20 years from now, you'll need to do X?
Very good question.
Like a long-term plan for the work?
That is really all. I mean, yes, Helena gives her recommendations and keeps this wonderful set of binders called The Last Word about each tapestry that has the most recent correspondence with it could be anybody. Sometimes it's the person who's just been around for the longest time and therefore knows the most about the tapestry, or it's someone working at the front desk, or who knows. But it really differs for each piece, and the approach and the knowledge differs for each piece. I would say that maintenance is always a concern. The redeeming thing about these tapestries is that they're woven to be very strong and very sturdy. So as we were creating this backing installation scheme for the Hudson Yards tapestry, Helena's line was, let's do this so that it's going to be good for 60 years. And I think that's really the thinking, is thinking in 60-year terms. Often, however, and this was the case with the blue wash tapestries, which were produced for the Pitney Bowes headquarters in, I think, Stamford, Connecticut in 1984. Companies change hands and headquarters change, and the tapestries end up kind of rolled up in a closet, and that's when you really need to be aware of what's going on. And that's where Mia was just this, just kind of saved those tapestries and gave them a new home. Blue wash, which is, Karen referred to these pieces earlier in her introduction. These are very large watercolor pieces, 40 feet long, actually. Originally 2 tapestries, 40 feet long, for a very modern, contemporary lobby. And Helena was looking around for a museum that had 40-foot long walls that could accommodate the blue wash tapestries, and found that really, they're very few and far between. So those tapestries were actually woven into halves. And so at Helena's recommendation, they were separated. The 2 parts were separated, and they became 4 tapestries. And so they could hang in the fountain court at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And they're beautiful there. It's almost like they were, resituated, or it's another kind of in situ location for them. And that's, of course, a very positive outcome that we would hope for with all of her work that, either has or will eventually lose their homes.
Well, and it's a good merging of locations. It makes sense there in a way, because of the fountain in the middle, and then you're surrounded by this wave of color, and you're surrounded by the sound of the water.
Mm-hmm.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I've been corrected. So for the 2 tapestries that are hanging at the yard, so we have the maple and we have the purple. They're each up at the same time. Is that right?
No, so they're rotated every 6 months. So the maple tree is the fall and winter tapestry, and then the clematis flowers, called flowers, is the spring and summer tapestry. And that's in line with the same developer commissioned 4 tapestries for another site near Central Park called the Time Warner Center. And there he commissioned 4 tapestries that rotate every 3 months. And they really represent the season. So this is somewhat in line with that idea.
Yeah, and is evidenced by why the installation, why the backing needed to be so secure and so permanent, right? Because they're going to be handled quite a bit.
Yes,
in tapestry terms.
Exactly, and so clear. And that's where we just hope, we have all these labels that say north wall, south wall, unroll here, so on and so forth. But we're still waiting for a final decision to be made about the storage of these tapestries and a cleaning regimen. So we have sent them photos of how we propose, vacuuming them. And that's something before we delivered the flowers tapestry, I vacuumed them, and this is how Helena vacuums her tapestries, using a window screen, and then of course a vacuum nozzle, and just going over the screen so the nozzle doesn't touch the tapestry, but really getting all the nooks and crannies, the dust that's settled on the surface.
We all have our tricks, right?
Yes, exactly.
Are there any other questions out there in the chat? I've tried to make sure to touch on what I saw come through. If anyone has a chat and they want to take themselves off mute because they'd rather not type it, this would be a good time too. And Betsy has put some helpful links in the chat. One of them is to a link from the site where Helena has, public museums where her work is available and their connections. And we'll also make sure to email that out. And yeah, I think we look great. All right, so if anyone thinks of any other questions, feel free to email me. It's info@weaversguildmn.org. We will send out a survey where you can chat about your experience, and if anything else you think of, you can put it there. We'll also send a video link so that you can rewatch this talk and miss the things that I clearly missed because I was taking notes. We'll also email out a set of links to some of the exhibitions that May has mentioned tonight so that you have that available. May, thank you so much. This was so great, so beautiful, such a punch of color in the middle of January, which feels really good in Minnesota. So thank you so much for your time tonight. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you to everyone. Yes, it's so nice to convene.
It absolutely feels good to convene. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was wonderful.